As we finish up the 1100 block of 7th Street and look ahead, we see Court Street as a cross street, and then we get into the 1200 block. But before we get into the 1200 block, let's look at Court Street for a second and where the name came from, or at least I think this is where the name came from, Court Street. Was there a court on this street? As we go up above and look at the satellite view, you can see 7th Street going up and to the left and Court Street going to the right. In this photo here, you can see the red rectangle coming up, and that represents where the courthouse for Port Huron was once. How do we know that? Well, because in this map from 1867, as we zoom in here, you can see this building that has a 7 on it, and that 7 in the index says that it's the courthouse. Not only was there a courthouse here, but there was also a court square, which took up part of this block and also part of the block where the Port Huron Museum is now. And you can see this map right here. Very old map. Matter of fact, I couldn't even find a date on it. Plat number 11 is where the courthouse used to be. And then, of course, you can see the court square. I used this satellite image to see where that court square would be today and also the courthouse. That would be the Port Huron Museum on the right and Grace Episcopal Church on the left. Sure wish we had a photograph of this. And this illustrates a map from 1897, almost 30 years after the one map that we looked at earlier. You can see that the courthouse is no longer there. You can see Grace Episcopal Church is there, and behind where the courthouse would have been, it looks like there might be a home there now. And then, of course, on the right, the museum hadn't been built yet, and that's the South Union School or the early Washington School that would be behind that. That's because the new courthouse had been built by then, and as we go north and cross the Military Street Bridge, go up Huron Avenue, to the corner of Broad and Huron, or now McMorran and Huron. And you can see the first courthouse that was in that location. But a photograph is always better than an illustrated map, and this is a photograph of that courthouse. This would have been before they added the wings to each side. Well, I thought that was an interesting tidbit, so let's continue now down 7th Street into the 1200 block. As we cross Court Street, if we look on the west side of the street on the corner, we see this beautiful home. This is one of the oldest homes in Port Huron, dating all the way back, I'd say to the 1860s. It also has a very rich history. The first record of ownership in this home was Silas Ballantyne. Some of you might remember Mr. Ballantyne from previous videos. He was the founder, along with his brother David, of the Ballantyne Dry Goods Store. Mr. Ballantyne's first store was on the southeast corner of Quay and Huron Avenue. Later, they would build a new store just across the street on the northeast corner of Quay and Huron Avenue, and became fondly known to most residents of my age as Ballantyne's. Most of us remember the store when it looked like this photograph right here. However, when Mr. Ballantyne built the store, it looked more like this store right here. The Ballantynes lived in this house until 1878, when they moved to a brand new home on Military Street. The next owner of record for this home was John Johnstone. Mr. Johnstone was a part owner of the Grand Trunk Elevator Company, and later on, around the early 1900s, he would also become part owner of the Botsford Grain Elevator Company. Unfortunately, both those elevators were destroyed by fire the same year. The next owner of the house is Fred W. Sherman. The Sherman Woods subdivision takes its name from the Sherman family, a family whose name has long been associated with Port Huron. The colorful history of the Sherman family begins with Lawrence Sherman, who in 1869 founded the Daily Times in Port Huron. predecessor of today's Times Herald. The owner of this house, Frederick W. Sherman, was a son of Lauren and was employed in the business and editorial departments of the Times from his youth up, and for many years was its business manager. July 7, 1907, he purchased from his father a controlling interest in the common stock of the company and assumed the entire management of the paper. In December of 1909, Fred Sherman sold his interest in the Times to Elmer Ottaway and Louis Will, and the following August moved to Santa Barbara, California, and there took charge of the Independent daily newspaper, which he had purchased the previous May. On a side note, Mr. Sherman's son, Fred C. Sherman, became a local World War II hero. He was an aviator and a 3-time winner of the Navy Cross, and later would go on to become a vice admiral. We'll talk more about him in a future video. The house was then purchased by Dr. Alex McKinsey, and his family lived in that home until the 1940s when it was turned into apartments. This would be a sad ending to a beautiful home. However, the story doesn't end there. The home is no longer apartments. It was purchased in 1999 by Carl and Trish Moss, and they spent 14 years and almost $500,000 to renovate this home to restore it to its former beauty. I was able to get some pictures of the inside of the house I thought you might enjoy, so take a walk with me through the home while I tell you a little bit more about the restoration. Trish Moss said that she and her husband never intended to purchase the home in 1999, but didn't want to see a historical landmark demolished. We do Civil War reenacting, and a friend of ours who plays Abraham Lincoln wanted a house of that time period to fully get into character, Trish said. So we drove by that house one day and thought it would be perfect, and we took him to see it. He liked it, but thought it needed too much work for him, so he didn't buy it. A little while later, the realtor who took him through the house called us and said, "The house is going to be demolished. You guys are the only ones who can save it." She really played the guilt trip on us, so we bought it. Before the Mosses purchased the house, 13 other prospective buyers looked at it, but none were able to secure a mortgage. We planned on taking 5 years to fix it up, then we would sell it, Trish said. It's been 14 years now, but we have done everything right and correct to the time period. The Mosses rented it out to a third party that turned it into a bed and breakfast. Although it's unclear whether it's still a bed and breakfast or not. It's not advertised anymore, and I couldn't find any information about being a bed and breakfast today. But one thing for certain, it's not an apartment anymore, and it will not be demolished. All right, now as we go to the south end of the block on the same side of the street, we see this beautiful home right here. This is the James Davidson home, but probably better known to a lot of us as the Victorian Inn. This was a very large home for Mr. Davidson and his family. It had a very spacious yard, very similar to the Valentine yard. Matter of fact, as we go up here and look at the satellite view of this block, you can see there's only 2 homes, one on each end of the block, with an alley in between. Now you may think surely some houses had to be torn down in between, but that's not the case. In this 1911 Sanborn map, you can see that even way back then in 1911, there were only 2 houses on the block as well, and you can see the alley that goes between them. The home that's just above the word Union would be the Davidson home. This home is one of 3 that were featured in the booklet Port Huron 1900, and it gives you an idea what that home looked like originally. Not that much different than it looks today, although the exterior may be painted a little different today. We can't really tell from this black and white photo. Mr. Davidson was a prominent Port Huron merchant and the owner of the J.A. Davidson Company that you see pictured here. I'm not going to read this whole page, but the first couple of paragraphs gives you a pretty good idea what this store was like. It says this: A large double store at 905 and 907 Military Street, occupied by James A. Davidson and Company, is one of the prettiest places in Port Huron to visit. The first floor contains the drapery and carpet and rug department, also the big wallpaper department, which is acknowledged to be one of the finest departments of its kind in the state. The second floor is occupied by the china department, which cannot be excelled in excellence of stock. And as we scroll down here, we can get an idea what the interior of this store looked like. Here are a couple more photos of the interior. It was a pretty classy place, I think, for that time period. In this rare photograph here, we can see who I assume is Mr. Davidson on the left with two of his employees. And if you look at the signage here, it says J.A. Davidson, and they've got carpets, oilcloth, feathers, and something else I can't quite make out. I'm not sure what the feathers are for. As we move over to the left in this photograph, we see that there's an outdoor display of carpeting, or it could be linoleum, because back then linoleum had some pretty bold patterns. I know we had them in our house. Today it would be considered pretty ugly. And as we scroll down, we see what appears to be the wallpaper department. Most of us aren't old enough to be a patron of the J.A. Davidson Company, but many of us are old enough to have been a patron of Sears Roebuck, which was in the same building, but many years later. I thought this was an interesting item. It's an old receipt from 1882 for linoleum that somebody purchased. Quite a little treasure. The Davidson family lived in this home all the way back from the 1800s into the 1950s. This house was converted into the Victorian Inn in 1983 and was then added to the Michigan Register of Historic Homes. It operated as a country inn. It had 3 overnight rooms with full baths, 3 dining rooms, and here you'll see some pictures of the inside. Nancy and I went there a couple times for lunch, and when you entered the place, it always felt like it was something special. When you had the lunch, you thought it was more elegant than the normal restaurant for some reason. A place that was very special, and I think it was. The inn was completely remodeled in 2006 for the Catch-22 restaurant. I'm not sure how long the restaurant was there, and I don't live in Port Huron anymore, but I checked with my friends, and it seems like they're out of business. And now, unfortunately, the house is up for sale. I hope somebody will buy it that'll give it some tender, loving care. Perhaps a restaurant, perhaps a B&B, perhaps a home. What a wonderful home that would make to be restored to when Mr. Davidson had it. So join me in my next video, and we'll head south down 7th Street and see what else there is to see.